Thank you. Good evening. My name is Greg Lounder. I'm the Executive Director of the Municipal Review Committee. This is the third meeting that we've held here in Hamden in recent times. Thank you all for coming. The intention with tonight's meeting was to really focus on the technical issues surrounding the project that have arisen as a result of the earlier meetings. And I just did, we set up a roundtable format tonight. The purpose being to really give Hamden residents an opportunity to sit at the table and join the conversation. So if there are any Hamden residents here that wish to come forward and have a seat at the table, I welcome them this time. Folks that are comfortable where they're at, that's okay too. Okay, now I'll move to introductions. I do have members of the MRC Board of Directors here with me this evening. Mr. Tony Smith is the Public Works Director of the town of Mount Desert.
And I'm Ken Fletcher from Winslow.
Thank you, Ken.
Kathy Conlon from Bangor.
Kathy Conlon, City Manager of City Bangor. I'll sit and introduce the folks at the head table here. To my left is Dennis St. Peter. He's the president of CES Inc. He's the lead engineer for the MRC on this project. To my immediate right is Mr. Craig Stewart Paul. He is the president and CEO of Fiberight LLC, based in Maryland. Next to my right is Mr. Mike Bilodeau. He provided a lot of technical support for the peer review carried out by the University of Maine a couple of months ago. Appreciate you being with us here tonight, Mike. And next is Dr. Hemant Benson. He heads up the Chemical Engineering Department and the Bioproducts Research Institute at the University of Maine. He was the lead peer reviewer on our technology back in February. And I appreciate your being with us here this evening. Next, ground rules. We are going to ask for those with questions. We are going to run through all the written questions that we received, and we've provided written answers. We're going to go through that first, and then time providing, which I sense we will have, and we'll open it up for additional questions. And I also expect that we are going to commit to having another one of these meetings, maybe around the end of June, following the submittal of our processing facility application. And so when we get into the additional questions, we'll ask folks to state their name and the residence. So with that, I'll turn the floor to Mr. Stewart Paul.
Welcome and thanks for coming out. And I'm here, like I said, once a month hopefully, and the next one will be after we submit our permit, which will have all of the engineering data and the like on record publicly. So after that's submitted, then we'll come back again and answer those specific questions. So in general terms for this, what we did was we sent out and asked for written questions, some of which were provided. I will do my best for verbal questions from the audience tonight. I have one of my engineering team standing by, so we're going to IM him. I much prefer to answer questions correctly over time than not at all, but we'll do our best for things which we're not notified in advance. Has everyone had a chance to read this? And do you want me to walk through every question one by one, or start talking, adding some additional color? How would we like to do this?
I think it would make sense to just generally.
Right. So what I'll do is I'm going to sort of pass amongst the team the specific answers. So the first one from Mr. Ganazzi, hopefully we got that pronunciation right, really relates to how close this plant is going to be to main trail. So So we've done a lot of work at, what are the prevailing winds, how far it is. I think Dennis has got, better specific answers
Yep.
to that one.
So that the first one from Coraline. At the first meeting, I think there was some confusion about the distances that we talked about, and I think it got confusing because people from the audience spoke up and talked about how it related to a mile. So what we said was that generally, or approximately 3,500 feet from the corner of this red square here is the building to the nearest resident. So it's about 3,500 feet. And that's what we said during the meeting. As Coraline mentioned, it's about 0.66 miles to the nearest resident. The property boundary is this or the proposed property boundary, which will likely be adjusted a bit once we get further along. But this property is 90+ acres, so it's a large parcel that the MRC wanted to retain to make sure there's a wooded buffer between the facility and any new development. So that's all the way down to here. And then there's also this kind of a purplish color, which is the rural in Hamden, which we know from some site visits, there's a lot of wetland out there, so it's not real developable. And then there's this area out here, this map residential that would only be suitable for residential. But again, there's a lot of wetland, there's a stream that comes through here. So there's a lot of wooded buffer between the facility and the closest nearest resident. We also helped to put it in context. This system is supposed to be replacing the PERC solid waste system, and just to help put it in context, the PERC facility is about 2,200 feet from the nearest Hamden resident, and there's residents within 1,000 feet of the PERC facility. So I don't know if that answers the question for later. Yeah.
So the next one, there was a question that was raised as to whether or not we plan to accept paper mill sludge. And at the moment we do not. The design basis for the plant is for 650 tons a day with some peaking capacity for summer capacity. There's no out-of-state waste, and there's no additional capacity designed in at this point for paper mill sludge. If we ever did that, we'd have to go through this whole process again, notify people, submit a new permit, and so on and so forth. So that's simply the no. The next question on what type of air emission permit PERC has, that actually is public record, but the main thing is that it's a major source permit. So fundamentally, they generate approximately 25 megawatts of power, and their fuel source is mixed waste. Our facility will generate 2 megawatts of power, and that's just for use on site. So we want to make sure all our heat and electricity we generate our own. But the main thing is the fuel source is not mixed waste, it's just the organic fraction. So it's a very tightly controlled fuel biomass that goes in, and we have extensive testing around that, so we know what's in it. And we have to file with EPA, a 2-year process to be sure that that was what's called a non-hazardous secondary material, so we couldn't have mercury and other such nasties in it. But there's a link here if you wish to take a look at the license in more detail between PERC and us. It's a much smaller affair, minor source permit. I will also defer to Dennis for answer to question 4 relative to air emissions and impact to Acadia National Park.
Yep, and then I think University of Maine might want to supplement what I say, but I think the question was referring to the peer review done by University of Maine and the reference to Acadia National Park and Moosehorn Reserve. And when they were doing the study, they didn't have all the details of this facility weren't known at that time. So we've advanced since they've done their peer review. And when I talked to them and I think another gentleman that was involved in the assessment, there was some lessons learned from the Old Town Fuel and Fiber facility, and as it impacted or potentially impacted these Acadia National Park and Moosehorn Preserve, which aren't related to this project. There's much more going on at the Old Town facility, a lot of other sources. So really, when you narrow in on this specific project, there is just no concern with Acadia National Park or Moose Horn Preserve. We've talked to the Department of Environmental Protection. There is no relationship with this project in those facilities.
I can share that with you right now. The comment in our report came because Old Town project suffered delays because of issues related to proximity to these national parks. And they were not prepared very well. And surprisingly, they were working with DEP, which is the state agency, but suddenly the EPA, which is the federal agency, got involved. It kind of threw away their timeline. So we just wanted to alert people that this should be paid attention to. And now that they have paid attention to this, they will take care of it. They lost 3 months or something like that because they were not prepared to answer questions regarding this particular proximity issue.
So these are the questions from a Moose Hollow resident herself. Mr. Which is why we put the first, but before we move on to anyone else, I mean, for some other folks from Moose Hollow, do you have any other questions you might like to raise?
I wanted to point out one more thing on a question that was asked, and the answer is the last part of the question was a list of chemicals, and that will be part of our filings. It's just in process, so we'll have that publicly available, within the month. So.
Yeah, we expect the permit to go in mid-May, and everything that goes into the permit includes all of this, and that's going to be public record, so make sure it's easily accessible for everyone to see.
And I think that's the idea too for a follow-up meeting. Once we're in a position to file the application, and then all that information has been available in the community for a period of time, we'd like to come back at that point and have additional discussion about the application itself.
Anything else before we move on from anyone else from Moose Hollow? All right, so move on to, so Bill Lippincott raised some more technical questions, being a former pulp and paper guy. And I'll start with the first question. So the question really relates to, do we have detailed process flow diagrams, materials balances, that we use to estimate air, solid water? Well, we actually, for the IRA project, completed what's called a FEL 4 engineering package, so all the way through detail engineering. And we do have a proprietary process model, so a dynamic process model that indicates, depending on what's in the waste stream, you put this much in and this is how much energy you use, these are the effluents that go out. Those have been provided for the 409 permit, for the waste permit. Again, in final form, all of that documentation is going to be available to the public. So it does exist, and we couldn't properly submit for a waste permit without it. And probably when UMaine was there, it was not finalized at that point. We have had some follow-up conversations. So the simple answer to the question is yes, it will be available, and it will be available within the next 30 days or so when the permit is filed. Didn't he?
We have actually seen the rough drafts, so we know they exist.
Byproducts, and you're exactly right, you need the process flow diagrams and mass and energy balances to properly calculate the byproducts. Those do exist. But in answer to your question, to what extent do the liquids from the processes, including blow down and wash down and process effluents, what are they and will they require treatment? Well, having run the demonstration plant for over 5,000 hours, we do have good data on what is in the wastewater, and we've provided that to CES and to the city of Bangor to be sure that these are all things which are easily treatable. They're not considered hazardous. I mean, any other comment on?
No, we expect that it's going to be accepted by the city. We just haven't got the final. They've said they've got the capacity to accept the wastewater, but they're reviewing the data.
And of course, any continuing effluent, that is tested on a regular basis, so we can't suddenly send something different than what we said was going down the sewer.
Yeah, there'll be a
Again,
pre-treatment agreement with the
Yeah.
city, and it'll be ongoing monitoring.
And to answer that, describing the form of treatment we plan to use, that actually is described and required by the city. So we're waiting on that specific advice before we design the final pre-treatment system. And I think, you know, a lot of this stuff is when we'll be able to give you more detailed information on quantity and character of wastewater. But now I can stipulate that the data that's been provided indicates there's no hazardous materials in it, and the detail will be provided with the 409 filing, again within the next 30 days or so.
I think the fact that wastewater treatment Bangalore is looking into specifically.
Air permits, I mean, the absolute clear thing to understand is that the amount of air emissions fundamentally are lower because it's 2 megawatts of power versus 25, and it's a homogeneous fuel as opposed to a mixed fuel. And the minor source permit has definitions of what we can or cannot exceed. And if we exceed them, we're in contravention. There's some pretty hefty fines if we do so. But we should be well within those minor source emissions as well. So we don't believe we need to purchase any emissions offsets. We don't, of any kind. Now, if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, if you offset those greenhouse gas emissions by avoided methane production from landfill, avoided similar emissions from incineration, we're probably negative. In fact, we've done various studies on greenhouse gas emissions. It's somewhat of a alchemy doing those studies, but the ones we've had completed for us with peer review indicate that we are 0 to negative CO2 emissions as the whole when you bring in the beneficial reuse of the materials.
So the detailed calculations on emissions will be available within the next weeks. We've done through the draft, and it's available. It's going to be finalized and put in the application.
Right. Obviously, when we file, we'll send you a copy of it as well, so you have it. So then, financing of the plant. We are finalizing a term sheet this week for our Iowa plant. There are 2 people actually bidding to build this plant. What's going to happen is there will be larger industrial entities with experience, deeper balance sheets than us. We'll build this plant. It's our technology package. We will continue to be involved in the process. We're not selling it and leaving. But we recognize that we need people with, you know, significant experience building these types of facilities. So complex biological processes, complex industrial processes. You know, making sure when we contract these plants that it's built to budget and on time. The people we choose to build them have the balance sheets and the experience to make sure it's done right and properly. All of these things are required for financing. No one's going to say, well, just go ahead and build it and hope for the best. It's a very complex thing to put together a financing package for what's going to be the best part of $60 million in this project. Now, what's going to happen in Iowa, we are scheduled to go ahead on July the 1st. In the waste industry, you never say never. You never know that something may crop up and delay you. Someone may file suit. You may find spotted warblers on the site. You may find Indian burial grounds. Things happen. So we actually have another project coming online of a similar size to the one in Iowa, right behind it. And a lot of this is to get to a point that we go from 50 tons in Virginia to 300 tons in a smaller project to 650 tons here in Maine. So we do have backup opportunity, and again at the next meeting we hope to make that public. I'm precluded from telling you who it is by confidentiality agreement while we're completing the term sheet for the Iowa project. But because of all the contingency we've put in place, and that there are several people vying to finance the facility based on the work we've done so far, I think the probability that it won't be running by 2018 is low, very low. We have bypass capacity in place just in case we're delayed. You know, we're doing our darndest, and we will actually have financial consequences if we don't deliver on time. So that actually, so before I move on, Bill, do you have any follow-up questions from my answers?
No, I'm Ken.
Pardon?
I'm Ken.
Looking at the wrong guy, I'm sorry. Bill, sorry.
Bill's over there.
Yes, at the last meeting, I had asked a question, do you have a plant, is there a plant somewhere in Europe that's currently using this process? And you gave me an answer, I didn't write it down. What was the name of the plant that's currently using the process?
There are several. If you look at, I think the best examples for you. One is Orgaworld, ORGAWORLD. That is in Germany. Shanks, which is in the UK, SHANKS, which is a larger waste company. I think Veolia in Europe also has similar plants. And what they call them is mechanical biological treatment. So you have a physical, what we call a dirty MRF on the front, although what we do is rather than have people just sorting through piles of waste, we go through a screening process and then into a pulper where we can, you know, essentially pasteurize the waste stream before it's then further processed. But if you look at those websites, they use what's called dry anaerobic digestion, and we're using a wet anaerobic digestion because it's more efficient and we get more conversion of waste. The reason that they can get away with dry anaerobic digestion, which is less efficient, is they are operating in markets with landfill taxation, so their tipping fee is $150 a ton, and they have feed-in tariff on the digested gas, so much higher value on the back end. But the fundamental of using a combination of biological treatments with mechanical upfront treatments has been well proven in Europe.
So in those plants in Europe, do they not separate the compost? I thought in Europe the standard was to separate the compost out, the organic matter out first.
If organic matter is separated out first, generally it's done in source separation, so it's done at the home. And again, that adds 2/3 of the cost of waste collection is in the collection. The whole waste system is in the collection part. So if you have a high population density and you can send a truck out and collect all, fill it in one day, they'll do that. And again, though, if you have landfill taxation and high value for gas, you can hide some of the additional cost of the collection in that because of that. The high solids anaerobic digestion does work very well with source separated food waste. They'll probably run into a few people put plastic and film, anything other than food waste you've got to then deal with because it ends up in the compost. You can screen it to a certain extent, but you still get small particles in it. And that's been the downside to people taking a compost approach, is that, you know, the quality of the product isn't quite there with, you know, biomass derived compost. A, and B, it's not something you can get rid of year round. So in, you know, temperate climates, yeah, you can store it outside, you can probably move it. In Maine in the wintertime, we'd be creating compost with no market and it would freeze solid. So we choose to do a more complete digestion or composting by using enzymes to break down the cellulosic structure into digested gas, which is something which we can make high quality, which is then used year round. Hope that answers the question. And I apologize for looking the wrong way.
So do those plants that you mentioned in Europe, do those take mixed in? Are those plants
Six,
taken?
7, 7 years they did. So Barbara, did you? Would you please raise your hand? Thank you. And don't be looking over here. Next time if I get this wrong. So I'm going to ask Greg to come in on this one. So what specific items would not be accepted at the Fiberight facility? So a very big part of what we do is what we call acceptable waste. And the contract that we're going to enter into with the township says, you know, this is acceptable waste or not. You can't always, you know, someone's going to put something in their trash bag, which is a black trash bag, which we don't know about. But big things like dead animals and C&D waste that we generally see when it hits the tip floor, but maybe you can help, you know, define what is acceptable and not.
Sure, yeah. Although I think Craig said it well, like, the plan with the new system is to accept the same material that PERC has for many years. And the written answer that I provided to that question is I simply looked at the definition of acceptable waste and unacceptable waste in our existing waste disposal contracts with PERC. And that's verbatim, you know, just lifted from our existing contracts. And there's just a listing of the types of materials that are not acceptable: construction, demolition debris, liquid waste, sludges, hazardous waste,
Cars, junk cars, I mean,
junk
things like that.
vehicles,
I'm thinking about what
wastewater
cars
treatment
and
plant residue, tree stumps, tannery sludge, waste oil, white goods.
They're actually not allowed tires and mattresses. Now, tires is an interesting thing. There's generally an infrastructure. Is there a good infrastructure for tire collection? Or do we need to aggregate them at all?
It's mixed, it depends where in the region you are. But
Yeah.
it is probably the highest efficiency on the tire side is probably because they are reasonably easy to spot in Lowe's. Probably most efficient to continue to deliver them as communities have been, and then we'll segregate them in the central location facility and you know, find the highest and best use for that material that we can.
Actually, before I move on, Bill, you asked me about RINs as well last time.
That was Paul over there.
Paul asked me about, oh, sorry. I will get this right next time. I've got an answer for that one when it comes up. So to your next question then is then how do we deal with those items that do show up that we don't expect? So what we have, propane tanks is a good example, because people looking at the bigger ones you can generally see, and they do go off at times. There's those little Coleman ones. Now, actually, a specific answer about that, the pulper that we use has actually been used for the last 25 years at Yellowstone National Park. And Yellowstone National Park has the biggest example of Coleman propane tanks in the waste stream. They actually had to divine a special system to take the gas out of them before they could recycle them to recover the metal. I've actually spoken to the guy who did that. When you get into a wet system, you've got much less opportunity for sparks and things which could cause them to go off as opposed to a flail shredder. And so ultimately they're going to end up through one part of this process collected in a magnet and recovered. Whether or not we'll have them in sufficient quantity that we'll have to degas them, I don't know yet. But we'll just have to see how many we get. But you're right. In the summertime here, we're probably going to look at a peak. You know, people are going to want to throw them away and they can't recycle them, so they'll end up with us. So
Mayors tend to use all the fuel they buy.
it's the tourists. But yeah, I mean, I hope that the written answer, you know, when you start, I don't want to go through this word by word, but during the process we go through different screen sizes, which are kind of designed to get these things out. And we don't want to be shredding things up to get there, because that does cause a potential fire hazard. We get into screens and a wet process before we then we can like see things, you know, on different conveyor belts. We can use optic sort. We can use a variety of methods to get to them if they're in 6 different streams as opposed to one big lump inside trash cans. And plastic bags and film. That's also an interesting thing. If you look at waste, 15 years ago, plastic was maybe 5% of the waste stream. Now it's 15 to 20% of the waste stream. It's just a function of the amount of packaging that's out there. So what we've been able to do, if you look at the video of our process on site, you'll see the process in Virginia. The films are very clean when they go through the pulping process. It's kind of a lucky win that the water, if you get the right temperature, it cleans a lot of the goop off it. So we're able to get them clean enough that we can sell them actually as a recycled grade, and other people compound them and they make materials from. You don't get much for them, but it's better than, you know, the alternative. We're also working as a backup on ways to optic salt to get clean enough, actually make it what's called an agglomerant, which brings higher value. And obviously the more value we get from every element of the waste stream, the better the rebates we send back to the towns. But that's going to take a bit longer. But yeah, there's a lot of plastic film. We'll see what happens there. But the beauty with that is that versus wet material like fabrics and cardboard, it's real lightweight, even with some water on it. So vacuum works fantastically well at separating it from everything else if you get it away from the pulp. That was all your questions. Do you have any other ones? Any other follow-up? Any answer that right, Dwayne? Okay. Is Sarah Lakeman here?
Maybe just to clarify, Sarah represents an organization, the Natural Resources Council of Maine. So they submitted a series of questions, some technical, others more policy driven. We took the time and care to go through those and address them as best we could, so we may as well kind of run through those.
Yeah, I'll give you a brief summary of these questions. So, how do we adhere to the solid waste management hierarchy? Essentially, in Maine, but generally speaking, reuse or reduce is the number one. So don't bring in as much material in the first place. Reuse what you bring in, then recycle, then incineration with energy recovery, and then landfill. That is my understanding of the waste hierarchy. Is it the same in Maine?
Processing in there.
Oh, there's a process
Maine,
step? Okay. So what we are is we're recycling. So we're number 3 in that hierarchy. And so what we're saying is we're building a new infrastructure to handle waste that is collected in the state. So if there's no waste collected in the state, there's no need for our infrastructure. We argue that waste will be collected in the state for the foreseeable future, therefore you need an infrastructure. And if you're going to build an infrastructure, build one which is higher up the hierarchy, which is the recycle stage. So it's our goal to recover 70–80% of what comes in as a recycled product. And so that, we think, actually improves the solid waste, it improves the state's stewardship of waste. The indoor air quality, again, this question was raised. This is almost 2 questions in one. So what we have in the design basis is a system of wet scrubbers and ducting throughout the building. We have the doors that trucks enter are actually fabric doors. They shoot up and they shoot back down again. And that means, so the exposure to doors being open to the elements is limited. We duct negative air pressure from within that area. Now, can you be perfect with that? No, but you can be very good at it. And the intent is to target a negative pressure of about 0.1 inches of water column within the building. What we found with regards to toxic materials is the second part of the question, like mercury. Now, mercury is that's the real nasty in the waste stream. And sort of the doomsday scenario is a dentist who retires and throws out his entire glass jar of amalgam when he empties his office out. When you volatilize mercury, so that generally means when you burn it, gasify it, create some sort of thermochemical system, that's when you create dioxins and other such materials in the airstream. What we found is because we have a wet system, we measure for mercury in all of the outputs that we've had. We've never seen mercury in any real detectable level other than sort of base background level in our PHS. So Al showed you that material, and we've provided that material to CES. We've tested it and we've not seen it. We believe that should there be mercury present, it will end up in the press gate. So it'll end up in the water system. And in the water system, we have filters and presses, and you end up with a cake. That cake goes to landfill. So provided we're not volatilizing the mercury, we believe it can be disposed of in the same way that it's disposed of now. Now, the other thing that we do that's different is if you think where mercury comes from. So Another current source of mercury is CFL bulbs, and it's in the ballasts and things like that. So look at our process, that gets pulled out on the line. So we're not grinding it and smashing it up and releasing the mercury. And to the extent that it is released, we believe it goes through within the water system. The other one, of course, is the bulbs in old thermostats. Those actually have quite a bit of mercury in them. And other electronic type materials. Those electronics will generally go through the first trommel, and we'll pull them off right there. That's the kind of residues that we're looking to get off the landfill, which is the most appropriate disposal method for some of these types of materials, is a properly lined landfill. So that is from our, several years of operation and looking for this type of stuff. That's our assumption of where mercury will be. Do you have any comment on that one?
I think we just need to make sure people understand. What Perk was doing was different. They were taking trash and they were trying to burn it. What these guys are doing is the front end of sorting and all that is the dry end. Then when get into the wet processing part, a lot of these things that would have been problem in other places are not going to be problem here, the way the wet processing is going to work. And that's what I think Craig is trying to say is, if it comes into the press cake, it will go out in a landfill because it's not going to be burnt in a biomass boiler. So this burning is very different than incinerators that you might have heard.
The third one really is a policy question, and it's hard to understand. So maybe you can answer this question about number 3. Do we support policy that?
All right, the question being whether we would support a policy that obligated municipalities to pull out as much organics and recycling prior to delivery of material to the Fiberight facility. The system we've designed is in place to augment the good work that's already being done locally. So we're not looking to disrupt or replace effective local recycling programs or source separated recycling organics. That can continue, that can expand. If the municipality somewhere sees it in its interest to do so. We're simply looking to add another level of recycling